So we'll briefly look through some important aspects of foraging behavior in birds. So one of the key questions in ecological studies when it comes to studying birds is understanding the role of birds in determining ecological communities, how they structure ecological communities and also how they influence the functioning of ecological communities. And another important question is how does the distribution and abundance of resources influence these interactions between different bird species? Okay, so this is what, this interaction between birds and their food resources is what constitutes the foraging behavior, right? So there are multiple parts to it. So when you look at foraging behavior, there are many steps involved in it. So first is how they locate the bird. So the search and recognition tactics that they employ to locate their prey. Then how they select food. There might be a range of things that a species eats, both in terms of the type of prey and also different sizes and other characteristics of the prey or food, and how do they select what to go for. Then there are many strategies and maneuvers involved in capturing prey and how a species chooses the best way to capture their food. Then of course there's consuming food. There are many ways of doing that as well. And finally we'll end with some examples of how foraging studies are useful in studying ecological communities. We'll start with locating prey. How do they locate their food? So one of the first things here that a bird needs to think of is forming a search image. Okay, so they need to really look for what they are interested in terms of their food. So here's an example of this is a very famous example. These are those peppered moths, pistil military. Yeah, and you must have heard about the impact of industrial melanism. Yeah. So during the because of industrial melanism, this particular the black moth escaped predation and increased in frequency. But in most natural systems, what we see is that the birds, insectivorous birds that feed on these moths, they tend to locate the darker form much more easily. Okay, so if you provide them equal numbers of these two, given the natural background on which they occur, which is lichen on tree barks, it's the darker moth which is fed on more frequently. So that's what. So when a species is looking for prey, it needs to have a search image. So it needs to know how the prey looks like, and it also has to optimize that search image with respect to the backgrounds that it occurs on. This is one thing. They also follow different cues or exploit signals given by something else to look for their food. This is a very interesting example from a very recent study where they found that great tits visit caterpillar-infested trees much more often than those which are not as infested by caterpillar. And they did some experimental trials in the laboratory. So basically, they painted them with these kind of branches of these trees, and there were no visual cues to tell them if it is more infested or less infested. So both the branches from infested tree and less infested tree, more infested and less infested tree, they didn't differ in terms of how they looked. So there were no feeding marks on the less infested trees, or there were no larvae that they kept. But what they found is when a tree is more infested with caterpillars, the tree releases some chemicals to make the caterpillar avoid feeding on it, and the birds are somehow able to pick on these chemical pheromones, these chemical signals, and that's how they detect trees which have more caterpillars. So actually they're not using visual cues, but based on the chemical signature that is released by infested trees, they're able to locate trees which have more food. Okay, so they use these very complex cues as well to find food. Sorry. Then another way of locating food is getting help from others, right? So one of the things that has been seen for many group roosting birds like crows, vultures, and many other such species is that these roost trees tend to serve as information centers for where to find food. So what they find is like when from the same roost tree, birds go out in different directions, and when one of the individual locates food somewhere around the tree, that individual tends to share this information in some form with the other members. So they have demonstrated it by basically what they did was there was one site with some carcass and they laced it with some chemicals. So basically it's some sort of chemical which it's a dye that they put there. So basically when the pellets come out after the bird consumes it is colored blue in this case. So by looking at the distribution of these blue pellets from the roosting tree, they could find that these ravens which roost together are actually exchanging information about where to find prey. The same thing has been found for vultures as well. They use these roost centers to find where carcasses are to be expected. Yeah. Coming to the selection of food, the question that has often been asked in ecological studies is, are they optimally selecting some kind of food when they are looking at food? So in this example, you can see it's an oyster catcher. It's a temperate wader, and one of the primary food that they depend on is mussels. And so the fitness benefit, that is the energetic benefit that they get from consuming the mussel, increases with the size of the mussel. So the larger the mussel, the more energetic benefit they get. But the cost associated with the mussel is, the bigger the mussel, the more is the handling time they have to spend in cracking it open. Okay, so while if you eat larger mussels, you get more energy, but you also have to spend a lot of energy in opening it to feed on it. So there are two models here that they have tested. Is that to increase the energy that they get from the mussel, they should focus on the largest mussel that they can find, right? But in order to avoid the the energy cost of handling large mussel, they should not go for really big ones, because then the amount of time spent in opening it would negate the energy benefits. And when you look at the empirical data, this is what it shows. So usually, so here we can see the distribution of the size distribution of mussels that are present in an environment, and here you can see the mussels that they have selected for feeding. And we can see that they avoid eating anything that is less than 10 millimeters in size, because it's too small for the effort that they have to spend for selecting it. And they also don't like catching mussels which are more than 40 millimeters. So it's the preference for it starts going down for it, because then it becomes too big and the handling time becomes too much given the energy that they can get from the mussel. So there seems to be some sort of optimization where they are trying to balance the energy that they get from the expenditure they have to put up for handling the food. So in this case, basically there are two contrasting hypotheses. So the blue line that you see, that is what will happen if it is non-diminishing return. Basically, you keep increasing the food intake, and if there is no cost associated with it, as you keep increasing the food intake, your energy intake also goes up. But where handling is involved and searching for food is involved. So basically, as you are looking for food and either searching for food or handling food requires you to expend energy, then it becomes something called diminishing return. So more expenditure you do for searching or handling food, your eventual returns are going to decrease. So this is what works with most foraging strategies, right? So usually most species tend to find some sort of optima between the cost invested in the cost that you incur in handling or searching for food and the energy that you get from consuming that food. Is that clear for everyone? Yeah, I could explain it if it's not. It's fine? Yeah. Yeah. So for capturing food, there are varied foraging strategies, and this has also given rise to a very diverse range of morphological adaptations, especially to do with beaks of birds. Like in this example, you can see these are all fish-eating birds, and all of them have very different bill morphologies, depending on the strategy they employ to catch fishes. Like these puffins tend to, collect a lot of fishes together before they consume them, and accordingly their bills are very different. Then pelicans have, they tend to take a lot of water with fishes in, and then they have they use a maneuver where they can expel all the water but retain all the food inside. So depending on how they forage, they all have very different bill morphologies, although they feed on the same kind of food. This is a very special adaptation in the skimmers, yeah, because that's how they forage, by skimming the water, and accordingly you can see they have a very unique bill. This is the tongue of a woodpecker. You can see they extend it, so you know how woodpeckers feed, right? They tap on the bark and then they extend their tongue to pull out grubs and insects. And you can see just to get inside, they have such a huge, very lengthy tongue which is retracted and coiled around the skull. And this is the unique tongue apparatus that flamingos use because they're filter feeders. Yeah, so they basically sieve the water and retain all the krill like shrimps that they feed on. You must have all heard about the hummingbirds, how they have different bills in accordance with the flower that they specialize on. And similarly for the sunbirds in the old world. And then of course there are, even with the given morphology, they can employ very different foraging strategies. For example, amongst the forest insectivores, there are very different strategies that they employ for capturing prey. Like some of them just glean, which is like just hopping on the tree branches and leaves and picking insects when they can sight them. Some of them hover like that, like sunbirds hover. Then there are also sally gleaners amongst the forest birds. So basically what they do is see some insect, fly, catch it and come back. And you see that for bee eaters, so those are sally birds. So basically that's what fly catchers do. So mostly like sit at a perch, see a flying insect, they just fly up, catch it and come back. So there are also these behavioral strategies which differ for capturing prey. Amongst ducks, there are these two basic categories, dabbling ducks and diving ducks. And accordingly, they have different morphological adaptations which help them specialize in these techniques. And when it comes to capturing birds, capturing food, one of the optimizations that the bird does is also deciding when to stop. So especially it has been seen in starlings, European starlings, where they have to balance between how many prey they can carry. So basically what they do is from a point, they go a certain distance, they find a certain number of prey, then they catch multiple prey and come back. So then there's this, and also there's another step involved. They have to fly a certain distance, then they have to search that area, then they have to capture a certain number of prey. So there's this entire expenditure involved in flying a distance and searching. So they try to optimize between the number of prey they capture and the energy that they expend in flying to that location and capturing and searching for that prey. So here you can see the mean travel time to capture more and more prey. They eventually have to spend more time in searching. So basically, they also try to work out an optimum between these two. Okay. So another example of optimizing feeding strategy. Here you can see some crows, and they feed on these whelks. Whelks are basically another kind of mollusk, and so basically if they feed on smaller whelks, then they need to fly higher to fly higher and drop it from a greater height to make it break. But if it's larger in size, gravity helps and they can drop it from a smaller height. So they don't have to fly that high to drop it. But another disadvantage with catching larger mollusks is their competitors try to snatch it from them. So if they have a larger mollusk, they have to, although they can just drop it from a shorter distance, but they also have to compete for it more actively. So what has been found is that the optimal strategy for them is to capture medium-sized whelks and drop it from a height of 5 meters. That seems to give them the best returns, given the cost involved in it. So the way we use foraging behavior in ecological studies is, one of the things is just classifying them. So when you are describing a community, you want to classify birds into different categories. One of the more common categorization is based on the kind of food they eat. So many of these community-based studies use this classification where you classify them as insectivore if they are primarily feeding on insects, frugivore, nectarivore, granivore, omnivore or carnivore. So that is one way of utilizing information on foraging behavior. Another thing that we also do is, say for within a community, a community of insectivorous birds, you can describe subgroups based on the foraging behavior that they employ. Like for example, here they've identified the species that use saline in the air, saline and cleaning under the leaves for insects. So they have identified these different groups of warblers within the larger warbler community based on their foraging behavior. And other important way you can utilize these foraging traits is trying to understand, adaptations, like the association between these foraging traits and some morphological trait of the species. For example, in this case, for leaf warblers, they find that the ones which have broader and wider beaks, they tend to employ more flight when capturing prey. So these kind of important functional relationships also you can work out by studying their foraging behavior. So I can take some questions.